How does a person answer why something happens?
When you look at the findings in different fields,
scant is the part of life in which we live.
To attain the highest values.
Hey, Alex, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me, Andrew. It's a great honor to come.
Yeah, I've been so excited. Like, I can't describe how it's like a feeling of Christmas for me, waking up this morning, looking forward to this conversation. I spent the whole of last night kind of reading all of your stuff on your blog, which we'll share a link in the show notes. It's always been a fascination of mine, the African bush, wildlife, and what it means to be an expert tracker. And for those of you who are listening to the podcast, Alex is kitted out in his tracking outfit. He's got this beautiful map behind him, like old school map. It's like, it just takes me right back to South Africa, to the bush. Alex, what does it mean? What does it take to be a master tracker?
So, Andrew, yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's one that I've concerned myself with for most of my adult life, and I'm not sure that I have reached the conclusion, but I can say that there are a few things. The first is that I found all of these master trackers have a deep sense of wanting to know more. There's never a moment of I've arrived, I know enough now. Curiosity is a signature feature of their personality, and so that's the sort of the base from which these guys operate. They like little children in a candy store. Everything is interesting to them.
Yeah.
Nothing goes unnoticed. Everything is investigated. So there's that whole idea of engaging with life and being present and noticing the big and the small. But so that would be the foundation of it. But going a level deeper, there's no doubt that the master tracker has to have a refined ability to think rationally and creatively, but at the same time. The trail, when you follow a lion, you are constantly zooming into the minutiae of the detail, and then having to zoom out and see the track, see the evidence within the broader context of the landscape. And we can get into that, but there's a whole lot around that. But and so that zooming in and zooming out is almost a skill unto itself. Being able to be highly analytical and then almost in a moment be quite innovative and creative. And I think master trackers have mastered that moving seamlessly between that's a steady dance between the rational, the analytical, and the innovative and creative.
And intuitive as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And the intuitive comes, I've found that the more creativity flows from a place of technical competence. You can't just show up and say, I'm a creative guy, I can track, I can draw, I'm artistic by nature. Yeah. I don't believe that at all. Well, certainly that is not true in the tracking world of wildlife tracking.
Yeah.
It's built on a solid base of technical competence, which the guys take years and years and years to learn. And then those chunks of internalized bits of information that sit deep in the recesses of one's consciousness get sparked at a moment. Something sets it off, and they link, and they'll have a burst of insight, which allows them to make an assumption of what an animal is doing so accurately. But it's there. It's been there. It's been accumulated over years and years. Those tiny chunks of information that are all vital to making accurate decisions.
Yeah, it's crazy how much this theme is coming up in the episodes we're recording. Of you have to first understand the rules to then be able to break them or bend them, or know like how to, like you say, bring the innovation and the creativity into what your ultimate goal is, which is to find this animal, right?
Yes.
In its own terrain. So it's amazing. It's applicable in so many fields, like you've mentioned as well. One of the things you've talked about is the role. You talk about the process of someone has this unique ability is a process of inductive reasoning. So it's this ability to pay attention to the detail in front of you, like you've been describing, have a consideration of the behavior of the animal, which so I'm going to let you get into these, and then a regard for like the overall environment that's happening right now. Can you talk a little bit more about that mental process?
Yeah, so I'll answer you in part in story form, or an example. So if you're tracking a black rhino in the early morning and you've been on his trail for hours and hours, and slowly the day heats and warms, and you've seen where he's been grazing, you've seen where he's slept, you've seen him mark his territory, you've seen a whole lot of activity, and now it's getting warm. You have to step into the skin of the animal. Renias always talks about putting the animal in your heart. And that's basically what he's saying, is to be compassionate for the animal's needs, be understanding for what it's doing, what's its intention, what's its motive, and based on the same environment that you're walking in. It's hot today. There's been he's done a whole lot, and you can eat, and then with local knowledge of the physical environment, of the landscape, which we know has a major influence on animals' behavior. Now at 11 o'clock, you're at 40 degrees, all this activity is happening, and there's a thicket with deep shade a kilometer or a mile up ahead from you. The master tracker in that moment leaves behind the detail, and he predicts, he anticipates, and he in an attempt to leapfrog ahead and close the gap on the animal. And that is that would be a deductive reasoning, taking what you know, the evidence, and making an assumption of where you believe this animal has gone.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're using a bit of inductive and deductive reasoning, yes. And you're kind of striking that balance, sort of like what you were saying earlier, between that intuition and the sort of knowledge and all of that. So yeah, and it's you're making all those decisions in your mind to be able to decide, basically in its most simplest form, on a direction of movement, right? Like that's correct. That's ultimately what you need to do. Yeah, correct.
And you also want to find the animal. That's the ultimate goal. But when you find it, when you have that encounter, you want to have the best possible encounter. You don't want a confrontation, for obvious reasons. A confrontation with a lion or a rhino can be harmful to you or to it, and it just breaks the relationship. The idea is to have a virtuous encounter that sets up tracking success in the future. And it also, if you are able to find that animal without it knowing you were even there, you can view it doing exactly what it would do even if you weren't there, and you get an insight into its behavior that no scientist or person on a vehicle could ever achieve.
Yeah, I love that. I love the way you describe what Renias says about, you need to, what was the animal's heart. You need to be in the animal's heart.
Yeah, put the animal in your heart. Yeah.
Put the animal in your heart, yeah. Be in its skin. And that's Renias Mhlongo, a character that will come up a lot, I think, in the rest of our conversation. A big mentor of yours and a big mate of yours. Yes. Before we get to that, I want to go right back to the beginning now. So that's a very helpful picture of kind of where you are at now in your career and ability. How does that get started? Where do you start if you want to learn this as a skill?
So there are very few schools in the world where you can go and learn the legitimate skills of tracking. Unfortunately, in the West or in the Northern Hemisphere, there's a lot of mystery around wildlife tracking. A lot of books have been written about people following silver lines and things like that. And I'm not saying that is not true, but that's never been my experience in 25 years. It hasn't been Renias's experience in 45 years. And we believe to mystify tracking is to undermine it as a legitimate skill. It is like cricket or soccer or tennis. It requires a whole lot of attributes, and if you practice, effortful practice long enough, and you have an inclination for it, you can achieve it at the top level. And so, Tracker Academy is a school that runs 1 year long programs for rural people, and those are sponsored courses. We're an NGO, not for profit. And then there are other training institutes like Eco Training that run shorter tracking courses. But in truth, tracking is a lifelong vocation. If you are to be serious about really becoming good at that skill, Renias and these guys, they learned when they were little boys looking after their father's cattle. They'd be watching a bird like a starling land on the ground and see what its track looked like. And he started to eat starlings, so he started to pay attention to its signs. And tracking is, broadly speaking, Andrew, there are two components to it. The one is the track and sign identification. That's the study of every single beast's mark when it comes to the ground.
Yeah.
And that requires left brain analytical ability. Then the other component is what we call the trailing. That's the following of an animal's trail of evidence until you eventually found it, like the story I gave you on the black rhino.
Yeah.
And that requires a more left brain, artistic, innovative, creative approach. And I find that Western people who have been subjected to Western education often do well on the track and sign identification, on the analytical side, quicker, earlier, and struggle with the trailing. Whereas rural African men and young women who have not had the benefit of Western education will automatically do better on the trailing side, but struggle on the track and sign identification.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So this is obviously, there's textbooks, there's probably can be done online now. You've got, you need to be able to recognize certain footprints, certain way tails trail along the ground. Like that's what we're talking about here when you talk markings, right?
Yes, exactly. The tracks and signs are the footprints, the bones, the feathers, the territorial scrape marks, even the calls. And if tracking were a language, that would be the alphabet. That would be the ABC. The trailing would be the reading of the language. And you can't do one without the other. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier effortful practice, and I love that. Deliberate practice, another word for it.
Yes.
What did that look like for you when you were first getting started? You've got textbooks and all of that, and then you've got the African savannah. What did a day-to-day learning experience look like for you?
So I learned it. I did not start with the textbooks. I started like a child would learn a language from a parent. When I arrived at Londolozi Game Reserve, I was 19 years old. I dropped out of a marketing degree, and I went to Londolozi to become a game ranger. And having failed a couple of times, I eventually passed. And because I was the youngest guide there by a long shot, they assigned me to the most experienced tracker at the time, or one of the most. And so he took me under his wing. And although I was the certified, inverted commas, game ranger, in actual fact, Renias was in total control. And but every day we'd go out and he'd have a plan. He'd tell us where we're going. And our guests would invariably say they wanted to see a leopard or a rhino or whatever they were wanting on the day. And he'd have an idea of where to go and how to start. And I just got into his slipstream. And I realized quite quickly that I was more interested in the process of tracking the animal than sitting in the Land Rover with the camera taking its picture. And I don't know why. And that's I don't know why. I don't think I've ever owned a proper camera or anything like that. And I used to get frustrated with my guests sitting for hours watching a sleeping leopard. And I would hear on the radio that there was a fresh tracks of another leopard. And it was such a cool challenge. A fresh leopard track is just such a wonderful prospect because it's so technically challenging. It's so difficult. You've got to, the three ideas of recognizing animal sign, understanding the influence of the landscape and the animal's behavior comes together so beautifully when you track a leopard. It's so technically challenging that it's the ultimate. It's the ultimate in wildlife tracking. And if you get a fresh track and you know that animal is reasonably relaxed, so there's a good chance that when you find it, it doesn't hide. It will reveal itself. Yeah. That is an unbelievable prospect for any keen wannabe tracker.
Yeah. I can totally relate to that. I totally picture that. There was nothing worse for me when our vehicles would stop and just park off and look at a bunch of zebra, for example, and there's a hunt out there, and so it was like not even the finding of the animal was great, and it is a beautiful, amazing experience, but the actual journey of finding is enjoyable. and the thrill of that. And I say hunt, I mean, it's the hunt to find them and see them. Talk to me a little, I think you mentioned this in your blogs as well, like the role of that intrinsic motivation that separates sort of a good tracker from a really great tracker.
Yeah, and I regularly see this in Renias. He's been at it over 40 years, and he's still, we're driving back at 11:30 in the day, and it's 40 degrees, and there's a fresh track, he will want to go. And all his students are long tired. And so he's got that, and I don't know where that comes from. And I've found even other really talented trackers, they track well, they're highly competent, but they're there for a job. They will do an exceptional job at finding the animal in difficult conditions, but when that job is done, they go home. Whereas Renias, it's a lifestyle for him. And I think my friend Boyd Varty talks about the mentality of a tracker. I think some people are just born with that you wanting to seek, you wanting to look and find out and discover, especially in the backdrop of nature. And I think that's what drives it. But to answer your previous question, which I don't think I did answer so well, I forgot to mention, is that, so I didn't start with textbooks. I just got into Renias' slipstream, as I said. And so when we get off the vehicle, he would be tracking and I couldn't see anything. For the first few months, I couldn't see really what he was following. Obviously, the most clear pug mark or footprint I would see, but 90% of it I wasn't seeing. And slowly with time, I started to see more and more and more. And there were two processes going on at the same time. When I started to learn tracking, I also started to learn to speak his language, Shangaan, which I couldn't speak. And he couldn't speak much English. And I remember about at the same time, about 3 years into our relationship, I realized I can actually converse quite freely with this man. And I was starting to, at the same time, also add value on the tracking front. He was starting to say to me, I'll go back and fetch the Land Rover, you carry on tracking. And he was putting me in these difficult situations. And increasingly, it was becoming more and more difficult. He was leaving me in increasingly more challenging substrate and bush to follow tracks. And if I lost the tracks, you didn't say anything, you didn't put me down. He was, oh, Boetie, you tried. That's great, you tried. And he'd come back and invariably he'd find the lost trail and we'd keep going. And I started to lose the trail less and I started to find the animal more. And I just got so motivated. But there was never there was no sort of finger wagging, this is the 1, 2, 3 of tracking. He just immersed me in the situation and then positively rewarded me when I did well. That was it.